I was so embarrassed I wanted to disappear. At my own cousin's wedding, they sat me at the kids' table like I didn't belong. Until a millionaire pulled out the empty chair beside me. I never imagined humiliation could sting so quietly, so publicly, and yet so personally, until that evening when I walked into my cousin Olivia's wedding reception. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers that looked like frozen rain, the air thick with perfume, laughter, and money, things I had never quite possessed in the right proportions. I wore a soft lilac dress I'd bought months earlier on sale, pressing it under my iron the night before as if smoothing out the wrinkles in my self-esteem. It wasn't extravagant, but it made me feel like I belonged, at least until I actually arrived. Every corner of that glittering hall shouted wealth, crystal glasses clinking, silverware shimmering under golden light, women wearing gowns that cost more than my monthly rent. I smiled politely at distant relatives who barely remembered my name, the same people who had once ruffled my hair when I was a shy child tagging along behind my mother. Now, years later, after losing Mom and watching Dad remarry into a richer family, I had become a polite ghost in their eyes, acknowledged but unseen. My half-sister Amelia spotted me first. She glided toward me in a gold-sequined gown, her perfume so strong it almost masked the fake sweetness in her voice. "Oh, you made it," she said, the corners of her mouth twitching as if forcing friendliness were physically painful. "We weren't sure you'd come. You know how hard it must be for you to fit in these days." I bit my lip, ignoring the jab. "Congratulations to Olivia," I said evenly. "She looks beautiful." Amelia's eyes sparkled with amusement, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "She does, doesn't she? Anyway, your seat's over there." She pointed toward the farthest corner of the hall. I followed her finger and my heart sank. There, tucked beside the dessert table and a pile of coloring books, sat a group of giggling children in miniature suits and princess dresses. My name card was placed among them, right next to a plate decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. The kids' table. I thought it had to be a mistake. "There must be some confusion," I murmured, but Amelia was already turning away, satisfied. A few older cousins nearby noticed and stifled laughs. "Guess that's what happens when you show up alone," one whispered to another. I straightened my shoulders, feeling my face burn, and walked toward the table. Each step felt heavier than the last. The kids looked up, curious and wide-eyed, then returned to their games, utterly oblivious to my shame. I pulled out the tiny chair, barely fitting my knees beneath the table, and sat down as elegantly as I could manage, trying to convince myself I didn't care. But I did. God, I did. I could hear my family's laughter from the main table, see the shimmer of champagne as glasses clinked, and watch Amelia basking near the bride and groom like she was royalty. Every camera flash seemed to exclude me deliberately, cutting me out of the picture, literally and figuratively. I tried to distract myself by helping a little girl open her juice box, pretending I belonged there. The small kindness made her beam, and that softened the ache in my chest, until I glanced across the room and caught a smirk from one of my uncles. The same man who'd once told me I was too sensitive when I cried after my father forgot my birthday. I swallowed hard and forced my eyes to the tablecloth. The food arrived soon after. Elegant plates of steak and salmon for the main tables, and for us, a collection of mini burgers and fries. I couldn't decide if it was a cruel joke or someone's twisted sense of humor. I cut the tiny burger in half with a plastic knife, my appetite gone. The room felt like a stage, and I was the punchline. My thoughts drifted to Mom, how she'd always told me, "Grace isn't about where they seat you, it's about how you sit." I tried to remember her voice, but the noise of laughter drowned it out. I blinked fast, pretending to fix my napkin as tears threatened to fall. I wanted to leave, to disappear quietly before anyone noticed. But then, a deep voice interrupted my spiral. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" I looked up and froze. Standing beside the chair next to me was a tall man in a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it was tailored by destiny itself. His hair was dark at the roots and silver at the temples, his eyes calm and observant, with a faint smile that didn't feel rehearsed. He looked to be in his early 40s, confident, elegant, but not pretentious. I blinked, unsure how to respond. This one? I stammered, gesturing at the chair. It's technically open. Perfect, he said warmly, pulling it out and sitting down without hesitation. The kids gawked at him like he'd stepped out of a movie. The adults' tables are overcrowded, he added, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Figured I'd get better company here. I couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh. Better company? I asked, glancing at the children flicking peas at each other. That's a bold assumption, he chuckled. Well, you looked like you could use some rescue. His tone wasn't pitying, more amused, kind, like he understood more than he was saying. He introduced himself as Nathan Cole. The name pinged in my memory, vaguely familiar, like something I'd read in a newspaper headline. It took me a few moments to place it. Then it hit me. Nathan Cole, the silent philanthropist and investor everyone in the groom's company had been talking about for weeks. He was the man their CEO had been desperate to impress. And here he was, sitting at the kids' table right next to me. I nearly choked on my water. You're that Nathan Cole? I asked hesitantly. His smile widened a fraction. Depends which one you mean. If you're talking about the one who spilled coffee on the mayor last month, guilty as charged. I laughed, surprised at how easily he'd put me at ease. Around us, conversations were shifting. I could feel the attention subtly turning our way. A few relatives glanced over, whispering furiously. Amelia's laughter faltered mid-sentence when she noticed who had joined me. I could practically see her jaw tighten from across the room. For the first time that night, I wasn't the invisible one. Nathan seemed oblivious, or maybe he wasn't. You're related to the bride? He asked. Cousin, I replied. Distant, apparently. Ah. His eyes flicked briefly toward the main table before returning to me. Family gatherings are always revealing. That's one way to put it. I hesitated, then sighed. They sat me here on purpose, you know. My sister thought it'd be funny. He studied me quietly for a moment, not out of curiosity but understanding. You handled it with grace, he said simply. The words hit deeper than I expected. You don't even know me, I murmured. Maybe not, he said, but I know composure when I see it. For the next hour, we talked like old friends. He asked about my work, and I told him about teaching English at a local high school, how underfunded the classrooms were, how much I loved my students despite everything. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. When he laughed, it was genuine. The more we talked, the smaller the ballroom felt. I forgot the embarrassment, the whispers, even Amelia's glare. For the first time that night, I felt seen. At one point, one of the kids spilled his drink, splashing Nathan's suit. The boy froze, terrified. Nathan just smiled, dabbed it with his napkin, and said, Battle scars. All great evenings need them. The boy giggled in relief. I couldn't help smiling too. The small gesture, his patience, his lack of ego, said more about him than his reputation ever could. When dinner ended, Amelia appeared beside us, her smile brittle. Mr. Cole, she said sweetly. I didn't realize you'd been seated here. Please, let me take you to the main table, closer to the family. Nathan looked up, completely calm. Thank you, but I'm fine here. Her expression faltered. But surely, actually, he interrupted gently, I was enjoying our conversation. It's rare to find someone here who talks about something real. He turned to me again, as if dismissing her with politeness alone. Amelia's smile cracked just enough to show the fury underneath. She muttered something about checking on the bride and disappeared. Nathan leaned back, unconcerned. You see? Revealing, he said, echoing his earlier word. I burst into quiet laughter, unable to help myself. The string quartet started playing a slow waltz. The lights dimmed and couples began to move toward the dance floor. Nathan glanced at the crowd, then at me. Do you dance? He asked. Not usually. Good, he said, standing and offering his hand. Neither do I. Let's make a scene. Before I could refuse, he guided me to the edge of the floor, his hand steady and warm. The music swelled. For a brief moment, I felt weightless. People stared. Of course they did. But for once, their attention didn't feel cruel. It felt like justice in motion. As he spun me lightly, I caught sight of Amelia's face, her perfect smile cracking into disbelief. I almost pitied her. Almost. When the song ended, applause erupted. Some genuine, some polite, all irrelevant. Nathan bowed playfully, and I laughed so hard I forgot where I was. For the first time in years, I wasn't the poor relative or the forgotten daughter. I was just me. When we returned to the table, Nathan raised his glass. "To better seating arrangements," he said quietly. I clinked my glass against his, smiling. "And better company," he nodded. "Especially that." And though I didn't know it yet, that single act of kindness, of someone choosing to sit beside me when no one else would change the course of my life forever. The air in the ballroom seemed to shift after Nathan Cole took that seat beside me, like a gust of fresh air sweeping through a room that had been stifled for too long. The chatter at nearby tables dimmed, replaced by the sound of curious whispers, and the clinking of champagne glasses paused mid-air. I could almost feel the confusion ripple across the hall. My family couldn't decide whether to laugh or to stare. For me, it was as if the room had shrunk, the chaos falling away until there was only him and me, sitting side by side at that ridiculous kids' table surrounded by cupcake crumbs and half-empty juice boxes. He didn't seem out of place, though. In fact, he looked more comfortable than anyone else in that entire ballroom. He leaned back slightly, his calm composure drawing in attention like gravity itself, yet he seemed to notice only me. "You look uncomfortable," he said softly, the corners of his mouth twitching with the kind of empathy that didn't feel forced. "Let me guess, family politics?" I laughed under my breath, the kind of laugh that comes from being caught off guard. "Something like that," I admitted. "I'm just the cousin who didn't quite fit the family mold. The teacher cousin who never made it big, you know?" My tone was half joking, but a little bitterness leaked through. He tilted his head thoughtfully. "Funny," he murmured. "The people who say that usually have the most dignity." I blinked, taken aback by the way he said it. Not as a compliment, but as a quiet truth. It was strange, hearing that word directed at me. Dignity. It wasn't something I'd ever thought of as mine. From there, conversation flowed easily, almost dangerously so. He had that rare gift of listening, the kind that makes you forget you're speaking aloud. We talked about books, how stories shape the way we see people, about teaching and how it often feels like shouting into the wind, about kindness and how small gestures can echo longer than grand ones. When I mentioned my mother, he didn't ask the usual questions. He just said, "She sounds like she was the kind of woman who saw light even when there wasn't any." And I had to swallow hard to keep my voice from cracking. It was like he'd known her, or known me longer than the 20 minutes we'd been talking. Around us, I could feel the mood shifting. People who hadn't looked at me all evening now stole glances, pretending to check their phones or sip their drinks. I saw my aunt whisper something to my father, who frowned slightly but said nothing. My half-sister Amelia, however, was less subtle. She strutted past our table, her golden gown sparkling like she was desperate to catch a spotlight that had quietly moved elsewhere. Her eyes widened when she saw Nathan, then narrowed when she realized who he was talking to. "Mr. Cole!" she exclaimed, voice sugar-coated with panic. "I didn't realize you were here tonight." "I'm Amelia, the bride's sister. Please, let me show you to the main table. We saved you a seat." Nathan didn't even flinch. He turned his head slightly toward her, his calm expression unchanging. "I'm fine here," he said simply, his voice steady and unyielding, though not unkind. Amelia's fake smile faltered for a heartbeat before she tried again. "Oh, but surely you'd rather—" "Actually," Nathan interrupted gently, "I prefer real conversation to rehearsed flattery. I think I'll stay." The words landed like thunder wrapped in velvet. The room went quiet for a moment, as if everyone had heard him, and I could see the muscles in Amelia's jaw tighten under her painted smile. She murmured something about checking on the bride and walked off, her back stiff, her composure cracking around the edges. I felt both embarrassed and vindicated. My instinct was to apologize, to smooth things over, but Nathan looked at me with a small, knowing smile. You were saying, he continued smoothly, about that program you wanted to start for underprivileged kids? It took me a moment to catch up. I had mentioned it earlier, barely. A vague dream of building an after-school literacy program for kids who couldn't afford private tutoring. I'd shelved the idea years ago when my father told me I didn't have the money, the connections, or the talent to pull it off. But now, under the soft golden light of the chandeliers, with Nathan's quiet attention grounding me, the dream didn't feel so impossible. I told him about it, the way I'd imagined a safe space for kids to read, learn, and feel valued. How I wanted to name it after my mom. How every time I saw one of my students give up because of circumstance, it broke something inside me. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his eyes thoughtful. When I finished, he said, "You've got more vision than half the executives I meet. The difference is, they talk about doing good. You actually mean it." I smiled, a little disbelieving. "That's kind of you to say, but vision doesn't pay rent or buy books." He grinned, the first unguarded smile I'd seen from him. Maybe not yet. By the time dessert arrived, the energy at our table had completely changed. The children were dozing off, their parents hovering nearby, trying to eavesdrop without appearing obvious. A few relatives I barely knew suddenly approached with nervous smiles, pretending to make small talk. My cousin Lena, who hadn't spoken to me since college, stopped by to say, "Oh, wow, I didn't know you knew Mr. Cole." I could hear the hunger in her voice, the need to be included, to be seen. I almost pitied her. Almost. Nathan handled it all with quiet grace, offering polite but short answers that made it clear he wasn't interested in their company. His focus remained on me. As the music began to rise again, the first notes of a slow waltz filled the air. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting a soft amber glow over the dance floor where couples began to form. I felt the familiar ache of loneliness creep in, the instinct to retreat into the background before someone reminded me I didn't belong there. But Nathan surprised me again. He stood, extended his hand, and said, "May I have this dance?" My first instinct was to laugh. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about breaking unspoken rules," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Come on." Every pair of eyes in the room seemed to follow as I hesitated. Amelia was standing near the bar, pretending to talk to someone but clearly watching. My father looked startled. My aunt's mouth was slightly open, as though trying to compute what was happening. And then, without thinking any further, I placed my hand in Nathan's. He led me to the dance floor. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, just calmly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The music swelled. I was acutely aware of how many people were watching, but when his hand settled lightly at my waist, the tension began to melt. "Relax," he said quietly. "They already judged you. Now let them watch you." Something inside me loosened, and before I knew it, I was smiling. We moved slowly, gracefully, not perfect, not practiced, but effortless. The world shrank again until there was only us, the faint rhythm of violins, and the pulse of my heart sinking to the music. His eyes held mine, not in a romantic way, but in a grounding one, like he was silently telling me, "You deserve to take up space here." From the corner of my eye, I saw Amelia whispering furiously to one of the bridesmaids, her expression a mix of confusion and fury. The same relatives who had laughed earlier now wore expressions of disbelief. The whispers spread like wildfire, but I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, I felt something fierce awaken inside me, a kind of self-respect I hadn't realized I'd lost. When the music ended, applause rippled softly across the room. Some clapped politely, others awkwardly, unsure whether they were applauding the dance or the defiance it represented. Nathan bowed slightly with a wry smile, and I laughed, unable to help it. As we returned to the table, I caught Amelia's glare like a laser beam across the room. It didn't bother me. In fact, it felt almost good. We sat again, and Nathan raised his glass of champagne. "To better seating arrangements," he said quietly, his tone playful. I clinked my glass against his. "And better company," I replied, matching his tone. He smiled, studying me for a moment. You know, people underestimate what happens when you sit beside the right person. It can change the whole night. I didn't realize then how literal that statement would become, how that one evening, one small act of kindness, would ripple far beyond the walls of that glittering ballroom. But in that moment, surrounded by people who had spent their lives underestimating me, I felt a quiet kind of victory. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just seen. And as the night wore on and the music softened into its final melody, I realized something profound. Sometimes life doesn't hand you power through grand gestures or loud confrontations. Sometimes it starts with a chair at the wrong table, and someone who chooses to sit beside you anyway. The morning after the wedding felt strangely quiet, almost unreal, like the calm after a storm that no one knew had passed. I woke up to sunlight filtering through the blinds of my tiny apartment, the faint smell of last night's perfume still clinging to my dress draped across the chair. My phone buzzed incessantly, vibrating against the nightstand. At first, I thought it was just my students messaging about assignments or one of my coworkers checking in. But when I looked closer, it was a flood of notifications from numbers I hadn't seen in years. My aunt, my father, even Amelia. The first message I opened simply said, "You didn't tell us you knew Nathan Cole." I frowned, confusion knitting my forehead. The next one was similar. "Did you really dance with him? The Nathan Cole?" And then another, "He's worth hundreds of millions. He's practically the biggest investor in Thomas's company. Everyone's talking about you." For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, still half asleep, half dreaming. The Nathan Cole I met last night had felt so human, so normal. I hadn't connected the quiet man at the kids' table with the headline-worthy businessman I'd occasionally heard about in local news articles, the one whose philanthropy projects had saved entire schools from shutting down. I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. "He didn't even act like it," I whispered to no one. Before I could process anything further, my phone rang again. Amelia's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated before answering, a part of me savoring the irony. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Hey," she began, her voice unusually soft. "So, funny story. Mr. Cole just called the groom's office this morning. He asked for your contact information. Apparently, he wants to discuss that education project you mentioned." My breath caught. "What?" "Yeah," she continued quickly. "You never told us you knew him. You should have said something. We could have introduced you properly." "I didn't know him," I said simply, my tone calm, almost amused. "He just sat beside me." There was a pause, thick with disbelief. "Well," she said finally, voice brittle around the edges, "you're lucky. Most people would kill for that kind of connection." "Maybe luck's not about who you know," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about who sees you when no one else does." She didn't respond. When I hung up, I sat for a while staring out the window as the city moved below. It was one of those small, defining moments where life subtly pivots without you realizing it. Nathan called later that week. His voice was as steady and warm as it had been that night. "I've been thinking about your program idea," he said. "You've got heart, vision, and purpose. What you don't have is funding, and that's the easiest part to fix. Let's talk about how to make it real." That conversation changed everything. Within weeks, he introduced me to his team of advisors and donors. He walked me through grant proposals, business plans, and community outreach strategies I'd never imagined navigating on my own. I poured every ounce of my energy into it, late nights drafting lesson outlines, early mornings visiting schools, endless phone calls with teachers and volunteers. Nathan guided me patiently through it all, not as a benefactor flaunting his wealth, but as a mentor who genuinely believed in what we were building. The program launched 6 months later, a small but bright beginning. We started with a single rented space in a rundown community center and a handful of donated books. I remember standing there on the first day, watching 10 wide-eyed children walk through the door, their excitement vibrating through the air. That was the moment I realized this wasn't charity. This was the purpose. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one asking for permission to belong. I was creating a space for others to belong. The news spread quickly. Articles appeared online. Local teacher launches literacy program, backed by philanthropist Nathan Cole. Photos of me smiling awkwardly beside Nathan at the ribbon-cutting ceremony began circulating. Suddenly, the same relatives who had ignored me at the wedding were reposting the articles, writing captions like, "So proud of our family's own success story." My father called, his tone oddly proud yet distant, as though unsure how to talk to this version of me. Even Amelia sent flowers, though the card only said, "Congratulations. So happy for you," without a hint of sincerity. I didn't care. Their approval no longer mattered. Months passed, and the program grew beyond my wildest hopes. Nathan helped me secure larger grants, and soon our single center turned into 3. Teachers volunteered from nearby schools, local businesses began donating supplies, and families who'd once felt forgotten started finding hope in our classrooms. I began giving interviews, not about revenge or redemption, but about education and community. Yet deep down, I couldn't help but notice how karma had unfolded on its own. I hadn't sought revenge, but somehow it had found its way through grace and growth. One afternoon, as I was finishing a class, a familiar number flashed on my phone. Amelia again. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. "Hey, sis," she began, her tone too chipper to be sincere. "So there's going to be a promotion gala for James. You know, my husband. It's a big deal. Everyone from his company will be there, including, well, Nathan Cole. I just thought you might like to come." I paused, recognizing the shift. Months ago, she'd made sure I sat out of sight. Now she was practically begging me to attend. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, letting my tone stay light. "I'll think about it." I didn't have to think long. When the invitation arrived, thick and glossy with embossed lettering, I smiled. Not out of pride, but closure. The night of the gala, the hotel ballroom gleamed just like the wedding had months before. But this time, the air felt different. My dress wasn't bought on sale or ironed anxiously the night before. It was a flowing midnight blue gown, simple but confident. As I walked through the doors, I could feel the shift in attention, the familiar stares, but they no longer pierced. They just drifted around me like background noise. Nathan was already there, speaking with a small group near the entrance. When he saw me, he smiled, a genuine, grounded smile that reached his eyes. "You made it," he said. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. He glanced at the seating chart near the entrance, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Thought you'd want to sit somewhere better than the kids' table this time," I laughed softly. "No need. I've already outgrown it." When we entered the ballroom, I could feel every pair of eyes on us. Amelia stood near the front, her expression frozen somewhere between pride and panic. The guests whispered, their curiosity palpable. The same relatives who had sneered at me now smiled too brightly, waving as if they'd always been in my corner. The irony wasn't lost on me. The evening unfolded with toasts and speeches. When Nathan was called up to speak, his words caught me by surprise. "When we talk about success," he began, his voice calm and steady, "we often measure it in numbers, profits, percentages, market shares. But sometimes success is measured in the quiet resilience of one person who refuses to let the world define her worth. I had the privilege of meeting someone like that not long ago. She reminded me that the right seat at the table isn't given. It's earned, one act of courage at a time." His gaze flicked briefly toward me, subtle but unmistakable. I felt a rush of emotion rise in my chest, a lump forming in my throat. When the applause erupted, Amelia joined in a beat too late. She looked at me, her smile faltering under the weight of everything left unsaid. For once, I didn't need to say anything at all. After the event, as the guests began to disperse, Nathan walked beside me toward the exit. The night air outside was cool and quiet, the city lights reflecting off the water nearby. "You did well," he said simply. "So did you," I replied. He smiled faintly. "I just sat beside the right person." I looked up at him, realizing the truth in his words. Sometimes one small act, a seat taken in kindness, a conversation offered without judgment, can reroute an entire life. As the night stretched around us, I thought back to that wedding, to the laughter and whispers and humiliation. I remembered the sting of sitting at that children's table, the ache of feeling invisible. But now, as I stood in my own story, no longer the outcast but the author of my own redemption, I finally understood. Dignity isn't about where you sit, it's about standing tall when they expect you to bow. And in that quiet moment, beneath the city's shimmering lights, I smiled, not out of revenge but peace. Because in the end, I didn't just change seats. I changed the table.